mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me today is Ducks Unlimited magazine freelance contributor John Pollmann. John, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Glad to be with you.
I asked John to join me today on the podcast to go over a feature that is currently in the Jan-Feb magazine, probably hitting mailboxes sometime within the next week or so. What this feature is about, it's called Geese Over Water. And so basically what John did is he reached out to a bunch of well-known goose hunting, I'm not going to say experts, but veterans, some guys who've been around the block for a while hunting geese, everything from Canadas to Specks to Snows to Brant. And what he did is he tied together different tactics that these guys use. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to add this to kind of our podcast lineup because it's just good, really, really good, tactics, kind of hard-hitting goose hunting stuff, which comes in handy late in the season, especially in January. There's a lot of states that still have some late season opportunities going into February. People are going to be looking at, I know some of the Midwest states have some great opportunities. Northeast has some good Canada goose hunting opportunities. So, John, I want to kind of kick this off with just kind of how you started this feature. Like, what how did you approach this as like, all right, I got to figure out which species and who to talk to?
Sure. So I'll be honest, hunting geese over water is probably one of my favorite things to do. It's, when you think about, here where I live in South Dakota, Canada geese are a bread and butter bird for us. And a lot of attention gets put on hunting them over fields, whether that's early season wheat fields or corn later in the season. But there's something about hunting geese over water that is just fun. It seems like they respond to decoys, they respond to calling well, they respond to motion. It's one of my favorite ways to hunt them. So then we just kind of looked at, looking at 4 different species, Canada geese, speckled-bellies, white-fronted geese, some Brant geese, which is a little out of my wheelhouse, but I talked to a guy that knows a lot about that, and then wrap things up with snow geese and visit with a good friend of mine that does it every spring. So, it was fun. It was fun visiting with these 4 hunters about what they do and how they do it. And, just kind of strengthen my love again of hunting these birds over water. It's just one of my favorite ways to do it. And I'm looking forward to trying out some of their techniques here in the coming seasons.
No, absolutely. And I'm with you. I grew up in Indiana hunting Canadas over, everything from farm ponds to strip pits. And I am all in on geese over water, no matter what. I mean, I would take it any day of the week. These guys I know a lot of guys who travel, even up to Canada to hunt, dry fields. And they, a lot of times they do really well on the Canadas and white fronts and snows. But I need some water in there, man. Like you said, I think they respond better. They decoy. They're just, super aggressive over water. I don't know what it is about that, but obviously you kind of dug into it and we're going to find out why. Let's go ahead and start with the Canada goose spread. And I think you reached out to Ben Cade, who's been in the magazine before, so kind of explain Ben's kind of approach to this quick Canada goose spread.
Sure. So Ben is somebody I've reached out to, a few times over the years, and I know that hunt honkers over water is just one of his kind of like me, one of his favorite ways to do things. And so he was the natural for me to reach out to, and it's kind of his main way of hunting. Ben kind of lives in the metro area, Minneapolis, the Twin Cities area over on the east side of the state, but he does a lot of his goose hunting over on the west side of the state, kind of in more of that Coteau area, the area wetlands. More traditional waterfowl hunting area in Minnesota. And so for him, it's a matter of, he doesn't always have a lot of time to do some scouting. And so this is a way hunting the birds over water where he is able to just go. He's got a pretty good process in place, and so he chooses a lake or a larger slough someplace where he knows where there are Canada geese using the water, and then he picks an area of that lake or water body where he's got some great visibility. He wants to make sure that the birds have a chance to see the decoys. If it's a windy day or things like that, he's going to choose an area where they're going to be going to have some protection from the wind and waves, things like that. But for him, it is all about visibility, putting himself in between a place where those birds are roosting, where they are feeding, and then he's just inserting himself at a point in between to run some traffic on these honkers as they come back from the fields, kind of a late morning type of a hunt. And again, it's about visibility, being in a place where they can see him, and then also he's very aggressive with his calling technique as well. And so, and that's what's so much fun about hunting these honkers over water, is that it seems like they are so susceptible, so responsive to calling, that it's, if you got a chance for them to see you and hear you, there's a good chance you might be able to at least pull off one or two birds from a flock that's passing by. And so, like I say, it's one of Ben's primary ways of hunting Canada geese throughout the season. And based on, what he's told me, the pictures I've seen, he's pretty successful at it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about this spread too, and I think some of our listeners, when you get your magazine, you can open this up and see the diagrams that are drawn out. They're fantastic. Some illustrations by a new contributor, Frederick Stiver. So the diagrams will be great, but kind of, really looking at this, it reminds me of, I had Field Hudnall on the show last year, and he loves hunting geese over water as well. But one thing he does a lot with his is he shoots a lot of ducks. So, while this is a specific Canada goose spread, these types of overwater spreads can really draw in ducks too, if the duck season is in at the same time while you're hunting these geese.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Canada goose decoys, from a visibility standpoint, are a big part of duck hunting spreads up here in the Dakotas and other areas. And hunters in various parts of the country use, honker decoys as almost a confidence decoy as well. Ducks love to land up against those honkers. And so whether it's, Tony Vandermoor down in Missouri or guys on the Missouri River here in South Dakota will use those honker decoys as a duck decoy in effect. And absolutely, this is something where it would be an effective spread for geese. It would be an effective spread for, like you say, if duck season is in, to use for ducks as well. And then I think one of the things that stuck out to me, when you're talking over water, motion decoys, this is something I guess Ben didn't put in there, but if you are going to do it as a combo spread and you have a motion decoy, to attract ducks, having a remote control or something where you can turn that motion decoy off, because that's one thing that honkers do not like. They don't appreciate that the spinning wing motion on those decoys. Ben does use motion though, whether it's flagging to try to get attention for geese, but he does say, he did tell me that he does tend to really bring that motion down as the birds are working in close. And a lot of that is just to keep the attention off of the hunters and off of the boat, which he uses a lot when hunting in these situations. But yeah, absolutely. It's one of those spreads that would work for both ducks and geese. I think really across the country.
Yeah. And I think I think that's a great one there for anywhere throughout the country. It'll be a pretty good set. We're going to move on. And this is, been the basically thorn in my side all season down here in Arkansas, having some issues with the white fronts right now. And so, you used a relaxed speckle belly spread, and this particular hunter's out of Northern California, kind of Sacramento Valley. What kind of spread, did he recommend here for speckle bellies?
Yeah, so with the specs, I talked to Riley Hall. Riley's somebody I hunted with last yeyear. I was actually on assignment for DU out in Northern California, and what impressed me when I was out there, and that again is one of the reasons I reached out to him, is that they really have kind of got the specs dialed in there by Chico where I was hunting. What got me was that it was a situation where they relied a lot on calling. But what they tried to emulate in the field, once they got the bird's attention with the calling, is they use a decoy spread up that is really relaxed, was the word that we use in the article, but it was really more relaxed. It was just natural. when you drove around this area and you looked at the rice checks and you looked at the birds on the water, you'd have a couple of specks up with their heads up here and there, but a lot of them were laying down, up against the levee, or they were resting in the water. They were feeding, they were content. And so his spread really tries to emulate that. To be realistic, to give them a sense that, that this is an area that is safe. And then a big part of that is the way he uses swan decoys, again, for visibility, but also because it just kind of paints this picture that, all is well down here in the water, because those swans are going to be in a place where they feel safe as well. And so, not a huge spread of decoys, maybe 4 dozen or so, and adding a handful, maybe some snow geese, and like I say, swans as well, just again to add some visibility and contentment that these birds would feel safe. And it was successful. I mean, we had great speck hunting while I was out there, and again, based on just the stories they told me and the pictures I've seen, it is something that works well for them. But again, the one part of that though that stuck out to me was just how aggressive they were in the calling, just to get the birds' attention. Because a lot of times, again, kind of like Ben Cade's in the honkers, they are not on the X. They are in between a roost area and a place where these birds are feeding, and then these rice spreads are kind of a loafing area. At least that's how they're treating it anyway. Getting these birds' attention, running traffic, getting their attention with the calling, and then when those birds are close, hopefully that kind of relaxed setup with the decoys is enough to convince them to come in. And like I say, it worked. It worked really well. We had great hunting.
Yeah, and I think the thing you pointed out there was, being really aggressive on the call just to get their attention. And then, it even explained, Riley even mentions that he really kind of backs off that call, which is something, goose hunters and duck hunters especially, we like to blow on calls. That's what we do. But it's a good reminder, these decoy sets are designed to be the attractant, not necessarily you catch their attention with loud, aggressive calling, and then back off of that and let your decoys kind of do the work and not try and blow these birds off, especially if they're looking for somewhere safe. Sometimes being a little quieter may be beneficial.
Absolutely, and especially if you're in an area with a lot of hunting pressure, and this is something that works for ducks, it works for geese. Anytime you have a lot of pressure, a lot of hunting, a lot of other hunting activity going on around you, if you can do something different, that will help you stand out. And sometimes that means backing off on the call and putting the call down and letting the decoys do the work.
Our next species, you kind of mentioned, this is a little bit out of your wheelhouse. I mean, you're not brant hunting there in South Dakota, I can guarantee. You probably don't have a garage full of brant decoys, neither do I. But you reached out to someone who's obviously been in Ducks Unlimited magazine several times. He's been quoted, very familiar with Mike Bard. He hunts up there, off the Atlantic coast. So kind of explain what his approach to brant are, which is an interesting, conversation, because there's a lot of hunters who really don't know anything about brant.
Yeah. I tell you what, after talking with Mike, I hung up the phone with him, when talking about them for this article, I immediately was like, how do I get out there to do this with him? Because it would be, it's that classic salt marsh setup, your tidal marsh, you're talking brant geese, you're talking the occasional black duck coming in, which is a bucket list bird for me. I still have not shot one yet. But just that classic marsh setup, hunting these birds over the water. For Mike does most of his hunting in Western New York during the bulk of the season. And then this brant hunting is something that they do kind of extend their season. So late season, December, January. And again, just like I say, to kind of extend their hunting opportunities throughout the year. And, Mike it's such a different experience compared to what he does for the bulk of the year. And I think that's another reason why he loves it so much, is that it's so unique. One of the things that he talks about, though, is that just how important the tide plays a role in what he does, which is a completely foreign concept to me. I'm landlocked. I don't know anything about tides.
You haven't checked the tides in weeks.
No, I haven't checked the tide in quite some time in South Dakota.
Yeah.
But the outgoing tide triggers movement in these birds.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they do is they'll try to find concentrations of brant loafing around, whether that's on the water or on the shore. I think something that stuck out with me is that he says that the brant love to graze on park and golf course grass, which is very similar to what honkers do here in South Dakota. But then he studies the tide. He knows that if he sees these birds while the tide is high, when that tide starts to go out, those birds are gonna be on the move, and so he tries to position himself again, kind of a run in traffic concept like we've talked about with honkers and with specklebellies, but put himself in a place between where those birds are loafing around during high tide and where they're probably going to go feed when the tide drops out, and so. He will, a lot of times these birds are going to go into these exposed flats looking for grass and for other things that they eat. But the one that kind of caught my attention is that he says that these birds the brant love to follow the channels within the marsh itself. And so he loves to set up where this channel will narrow down, where the birds then will be more susceptible to decoy, be better in range. Within these channels in between these areas. And so there's it sounds a ton of fun. And he says the thing that I love to hear too is that brant apparently are very decoy friendly. They decoy well out of the water. So if you're in the right spot, chances are you're going to have some pretty good luck. And so it's something I really, really hope to do someday. It doesn't seem like it's not outside of the boat and the knowledge of the tide and things like that, which I realize is a big piece of this. There's not a lot of decoys that go into it.
I was going to mention that.
Spreads are pretty small, a couple dozen floaters. He uses some silhouettes to kind of help break up the outline of the blind or the boat or wherever they're at. And then he'll toss a few duck decoys out as well for black ducks, sometimes some divers, things like that in the area. And so I'm all for it. I want to get out there east. I just got to figure out a time when I can get out and meet up with Mike and do it. But I'd love to get out there someday. It just sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does. And like you said, having extensive knowledge of the tides is probably number one, most important here. You kind of mentioned the article, even throughout the hunt. I mean, I think for landlocked duck hunters like ourselves, we don't sometimes take into account how difficult hunting the tides can be. I mean, mention here that Mike is even moving his decoys multiple times throughout the hunt as the tide goes out. He's having to move the boat, he's having to move the decoys, he's having to, shift things around as that tide goes in and out, and your conditions are constantly changing. We don't necessarily have to deal with that in some of the situations where you and I hunt. So
no, absolutely not. No, and it's one of those things too where if I was going to do this, I honestly, obviously, I'm not going to be doing this on my own. You're going to want to be with somebody that knows what to do, that's got some, it's got some sea legs, it's been on the water before and understands those things. So, yeah, I think if you get those things figured out, get yourself in a spot between loafing and feeding, it sounds like it's a pretty good show.
Yeah, if you and I did this on our own, we'd end up high and dry somewhere, having to wait for the tide to come back and pick our boat up just to get out. I could see. Yeah, it would not be good. We'll trust Mike's expertise on this for sure.
Exactly, for sure.
So the last one that you did was a small water snow goose spread, and this is with your good buddy Ben Fouillon out there in South Dakota. So, kind of explain his approach. I know he's probably got a million different sets up there for some of the ways that he hunts snows, especially. But I am all about hunting snow geese over water as well. So let's dive into this one and what makes this one so, specific to what Ben does.
Yeah. So Ben is in terms of a duck and goose hunter. There aren't many people there isn't anyone I put above Ben. I mean, the guy knows what he's doing. He's and what keeps Ben successful is that he is innovative. He changes. He reacts to the birds. He'll try new things to stand out and be different. But one of the things that stays consistent for him is these water setups for snow geese in the spring, and it's. You're playing off of those birds, their drive to get up north. Those adult birds are pushing the snow line, pushing the ice line to get up there. And oftentimes that means there isn't a ton of open water available. So if you're able to create some open water, whether that's cutting a hole in the ice or using an ice eater or whatever it is, if you can create that open water for them, it usually is a pretty good magnet for those birds that are pushing north in the spring. For Ben, he's looking for a couple of things. He wants to have, the setup is usually, it's not going to be on like a typical, like a lake or a slough or anything. Well, a slough maybe, but it's like a pasture pond. Where they've got that short grass that those birds love to go and loaf in and lay down in during the day and kind of graze throughout the day. So something like that, or like a harvested corn or a soybean field next to it. And so again, where these birds will, and if you drive through South Dakota in the spring or any of these northern states, it's what you see where these snow geese are congregated. They've got this pond or an area of open water, and then they just kind of bounce back and forth with an adjacent field throughout the day to loaf and to feed and whatnot. And so he's looking for that situation. And then it needs to be in an area where you traditionally see a lot of bird traffic. And, if you spend enough time in Missouri or Nebraska or Kansas or South Dakota here, there are these corridors where these birds tend to follow year after year after year. And so he's got a few spots like where he knows that birds are going to be overhead. And so it's a numbers game. And so if he's got birds above him, he knows there's going to be a certain percentage of those that are going to be able to, or they're going to want to come down and check things out. Other thing that he kind of keeps in mind is that his water setups, he keeps them away though from a major stopping point, whether that's a refuge or a large water body, where because you simply cannot compete with real birds on the ground. And that honestly, I've talked to Ben enough about this. I know that is something that he does, whether it is a field setup or a water setup. You want to stay downwind, down the flyway from these major stopping points, or, on the flip side, you don't want to be on the north side of one as birds leave in the morning. You want to keep some distance between you and those major stopping areas because you can't compete. Even if you've got 1,500, 2,000 full body, the best full body decoys on the market, it doesn't matter. You're not going to pull those geese when they have 100,000 snow geese a mile away, swirling, tornading down over a large lake or whatnot. So in an area of traffic, far enough away from a major stopping point that you're not going to lose birds to that. And then again, having that water pasture or water cornfield or soybeans, that combination, it's a pretty good combination for these spring snows.
One thing that I think is interesting is how, he's using very few floaters out here in this kind of pasture pond, I guess is what you referred to it as. And so he's not filling up this little area of water with tons of floaters, but on the backside of that, it's like he's running 1,500 full bodies on the other side of it. So as it spreads out into this field, he's got a bunch of decoys, and that's one thing. Anytime you're talking snow geese, you're talking numbers, you're talking. You better have a passion for setting decoys. But the interesting part about his spread is he's keeping his blind, 40 to 50 yards away from the water, kind of on the upwind side. So as these birds kind of decoy in, that's when he's really getting his shot.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to Ben changing his plan over the years and just observing things. They typically were seeing birds wanting to, if they had the blind up on the water's edge, trying to shoot those birds over the water, and that presented a couple problems. One was that the birds continually wanted to work behind the blind to work the birds that were up on the dry ground, and so the decision was made to move that blind back to just take advantage of what those birds wanted to do in the first place. The other thing, and this is pretty important to Ben because he's a dog guy, is that dropping those snow geese in the water was an issue. It meant that you had to have a tender boat or something there, because typically these pasture ponds are going to have deeper water. So it's not something where you're going to wade out and grab the birds yourselves. And so you're depending on your dogs, or you're depending on a tender boat. The tender boat is it's another piece of gear that you have to have. And so it somewhat has eliminated the need for that. And the other is that Springtime is hard for a retriever because of the temperatures and because of the ice that builds up every day. You have a big warm up during the day, then at night it usually dips down below freezing again. And so these dogs were having to deal with either going through ice to make the retrieve, or walking out on ice that maybe isn't really stable. And so it makes it a safer situation for the hunters and for the dogs themselves. And so it's a lot easier to pick up 12 geese that fall into the corn stubble around a pasture than it is to pick up, a dozen snows that fell down in the water. And so, like I say, combination of the two things, reacting to what the birds were doing, and then it just makes the hunt a little bit safer and a little bit easier.
Yeah, another thing you mentioned here that I think I should point out is that this is not like a feed spread. He's not trying to imitate a feed. What he's imitating is a loafing scenario where these birds have already fed in the morning, and now they're looking for somewhere to get a drink, stay safe, maybe take a nap, float around on some water for a little bit, not have to worry about, being shot at or flying around. They spend their time just kind of what it is. They're loafing. So for hunters to keep that in mind, that, typically you see, most snow goose spreads are set up with the mentality that you're trying to look like a feed, where Ben's set up here. He's not trying to look like a feed. He's trying to look like a loafing area.
Exactly. And it's one of those situations too, where it's you don't have to be out there at the break of dawn. It's typically the action starts to heat up after sunrise, a couple hours after sunrise. And then it kind of stays steady throughout the day. There's a lull in the afternoon when birds have kind of settled down. They're not doing much moving. And then again, toward evening, it can be something again where the birds are starting to move again toward nightfall. Obviously those, Ben and the guys that he takes out as his crew, they are out there at sunrise anyway, but they know that they've got a little bit of time before things are really going to start to heat up. And again, anytime I talk about spring snow goose hunting, I always like to mention that if you haven't done it before, it's beyond the opportunities to shoot snow geese and watch them work the decoys, which is a blast. It really is. Just being able to see the spring migration. For us up here in South Dakota, we see these birds in the fall, and sometimes they're still kind of drab. They're brown. They're not looking great, because they're just fresh off the prairies. But they come back in the spring and they're wearing their breeding plumage. They are absolutely gorgeous. The ducks don't have anything to be afraid of. You tend to see them work the decoys. They're covering you up all morning, whether it's mallards or pintails or widgeon or whatever it is. And Canada geese and every single subspecies of Canada goose you can think of, moves through here, white fronts, things like that. It's a spectacle. And to be able to do it from the comfort of a blind up on dry ground, but you've got the water there to attract the ducks. It's a great time of the year. It's one of my favorite things. One of my favorite ways to hunt ducks, or to hunt geese. Excuse me. Again, not just because of the opportunities, but just because of the sights and the sounds and the spring weather and the prairie starting to wake up again. It's just a great way to spend a day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a fantastic way, and I think we get a lot of that down here as well, where when we're hunting snows, ducks just pour in, and you're right, it is an absolute spectacle just to see. So that's a great part. Well, John, these have been fantastic. Listeners can check this out, and I highly encourage people to do that in the magazine. Check out these illustrations that are in here that accompany each one of these little tips that John explained. It'll be online. It'll be on ducks.org as well here very shortly, so people can look at it there. But in the magazine, the spread there obviously just looks fantastic. So this is great work on this one, John, once again, and appreciate you coming on here and really sharing the details of each one of these specific goose spreads.
Absolutely. Anytime, Chris. Appreciate it.
I'd like to thank my guest, John Pollmann, for joining me today and going through his January-February feature, Geese Over Water. Also like to thank Chris Isaac, our producer, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU Podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.